I want you to picture something with me for a second. 38 Navy SEALs, America's most elite warriors, trapped in an Afghan valley that's become a kill box. Enemy fighters on 3 sides, ammunition running out, helicopters can't get in, F-16s can't shoot close enough without killing our own people. And somewhere in an operations center 8,000 miles from home, a major is quietly starting to draft the casualty report, because every tactical manual, every rule of engagement, every lesson learned in 20 years of war says the same thing. Those men are already dead. Except one person refused to accept that answer. A 26-year-old A-10 pilot they'd been keeping off combat missions because she was too emotional, too untested, too young, too female, though nobody said that part out loud anymore. Her name was Captain Delaney Thomas, and what she did in the next 73 minutes would rewrite the book on close air support and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a war zone isn't the enemy. It's the assumption that certain kinds of people aren't ready for certain kinds of fights. This is her story, and before we dive in, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who's ever been underestimated, everyone who's ever been told they're not ready, everyone who's ever looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible just meant nobody had tried hard enough yet. Let's go back to where it started. Not in that valley, not even in Afghanistan, but in a briefing room at Kandahar Airfield 6 months earlier, where Captain Delaney Thomas sat in the back row taking notes nobody had asked for on a tactical problem nobody wanted to hear about. The briefing was routine, updates on enemy movement patterns, threat assessments, logistics coordination. Major Kyle Sanderson ran the show like he ran everything, by the book, by the numbers, with zero tolerance for speculation or creative thinking. He was 42 years old, had 3 combat tours under his belt, and believed that the military worked because people followed procedures that had been written in blood by people smarter than them. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't stupid, he was just absolutely convinced that 20-year-old doctrine was the ceiling of human tactical innovation. Delaney raised her hand during the threat assessment portion. Sanderson sighed, the kind of sigh that said he already regretted calling on her, but couldn't ignore a raised hand in a room full of witnesses. Captain Thomas, what is it?
Sir, I've been tracking the enemy logistics pattern in the Korangal corridor, she said, her voice carrying that slight Irish lilt that made some people take her less seriously and others pay closer attention. The movement we're seeing isn't consistent with offensive preparation. It looks more like they're setting conditions for a pincer trap, drawing us into a valley where air support doctrine breaks down.
The room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone says something uncomfortable and everyone's waiting to see how leadership responds. Sanderson's jaw tightened. Captain Thomas, your job is to track equipment and maintain flight readiness, not to armchair quarterback intelligence assessments that go through 3 levels of analysis before they reach this room. Yes, sir. I just thought... Track equipment, Captain. That's what I need from you. Delaney felt the heat rise in her face. Not anger, not embarrassment, something in between. The thing that happens when you know you're right, but the world around you has decided that your rightness doesn't matter because of who's delivering it. She nodded, said yes, sir, sat down, and made a decision that would echo 6 months later in a valley full of dying men. She would keep tracking, keep analyzing, keep preparing for the scenario everyone else had decided was impossible. Because here's what nobody in that room understood about Delaney Thomas. She hadn't ended up in Afghanistan by accident. She'd fought for it, clawed for it, survived a qualification pipeline that had broken stronger candidates, mastered an aircraft that forgave nothing, and done it all while carrying the weight of being one of only 12 female A-10 pilots in the entire Air Force. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, knew that every mistake she made would be remembered as proof that women didn't belong in cockpits, while every mistake a male pilot made would be remembered as Tuesday. So she didn't make mistakes. She made herself perfect, or as close as a human being could get. That night, long after the rest of the squadron had gone to bed, Delaney sat in a simulator that nobody had authorized her to use, running a scenario that nobody had asked her to practice. Friendlies surrounded in a valley, surface-to-air missiles on the ridgelines, enemy forces so close that standard doctrine said air support was impossible. And she practiced dying, over and over, tried the textbook approaches and watched her simulated aircraft get shredded by SAMs, tried aggressive gun runs and watched her 30mm cannon rounds land on friendly positions, tried standoff weapons and watched the range limitations make her irrelevant. 47 times she ran that scenario. 47 times she died, or the friendlies died, or both. And then, on attempt 48, she found the seam, found the angle, found the way to thread the needle if you were willing to fly lower than doctrine allowed, shoot closer than comfort zones permitted, and trust your hands more than the targeting computer. She wrote it all down in a notebook she kept locked in her personal locker. Angles, airspeeds, weapon settings, radio procedures, everything. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, in that place where instinct lives before logic can kill it, she knew this scenario wasn't theoretical.
It was rehearsal.
3 months later, the intelligence started shifting. Enemy activity in the Korangal corridor was intensifying. Not random harassment, but coordinated, deliberate positioning. Delaney updated her analysis and submitted it through proper channels. It disappeared into the bureaucratic void. She updated it again 2 weeks later, same result. By the third submission, she stopped expecting anyone to read it and just kept the information current for herself. Because when something happened, she wanted to be ready. She started sleeping less, not from stress, from preparation. Every night, another hour in the simulator. Every morning, another review of terrain maps, studying every fold in those valleys like she was reading a book written in stone. She memorized distances, ridge heights, dead zones where aircraft couldn't see and ground forces couldn't maneuver. She calculated gun run angles that didn't exist in any manual because the manuals assumed you'd never be desperate enough to try them. Her roommate, a transport pilot named Jennifer Kowalski, finally asked the question everyone else was too polite or too indifferent to voice. "Laney, what are you preparing for?"
Delaney looked up from a topographic map covered in pencil marks. The thing they're not preparing for.
Which is a conventional trap in an unconventional space. They're going to bait us into a valley where jets can't help and close air support becomes Russian roulette. And when it happens, someone's going to have to decide whether following the rules matters than bringing people home.
Jen studied her friend's face. "You think that someone's going to be you?"
"I think I'm the only one practicing like it might be." The morning of June 14th started like every other morning at Kandahar. Oppressive heat by 0600. Flight line operations running through pre-mission checks. Delaney suited up for what was supposed to be a training mission, formation work with new pilots, the kind of routine duty they gave to capable pilots who weren't quite trusted with the real work yet. She didn't complain. Complaining got you labeled as difficult. Difficult got you sent home. So she smiled, said yes sir, and prepared for another day of being professionally underutilized. At 6:30, Major Sanderson found her running pre-flight on aircraft 297, her assigned A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. Ugly as sin, tough as nails, built around a 30mm cannon that could shred tanks and supported by titanium armor thick enough to take hits that would down any other aircraft. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, but in the right hands, it could perform miracles. "Thomas," Sanderson said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Change of plans. I need you on ground operations coordination today. Lieutenant Morrison will take your bird for the training sortie." Something in Delaney's chest tightened. "Sir, I'm already pre-flighted and I need steady leadership on that training flight, Captain. Morrison's got the experience." "Not you, never you. No matter how many hours you fly, how many scenarios you master, how many times you prove yourself. Because somewhere in Sanderson's mental math, steady leadership would never include a 26-year-old woman with red hair and an Irish accent. Delaney forced herself to nod. Yes, sir. Because what else could she say? The military didn't run on fairness. It ran on orders. But as she watched Morrison climb into her aircraft, her bird, the one she'd maintained and memorized and bonded with the way pilots do, something settled in her gut, a cold certainty that tasted like metal. This was the day. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. She spent the morning in the operations center, tracking routine missions, updating status boards, doing the kind of work that any competent airman could do, but that got assigned to pilots when leadership wanted them out of the way. And she watched the intelligence feeds, watched the enemy movement indicators, watched the pattern she'd been warning about for months finally coalesce into something undeniable. At 13:47 hours, the base siren shattered the routine. Not a drill, not a test. The sound that meant American lives were in immediate danger. Delaney was on her feet before the second pulse, moving toward the operations center at a run, her mind already calculating distances, fuel loads, weapons configurations. And when she burst through the door and saw the tactical display, her blood turned to ice. Korangal Valley, the exact grid coordinates she'd circled in red pencil 3 months ago. 38 Navy SEALs, surrounded by an enemy force estimated at 800 fighters. Surface-to-air missiles confirmed on 2 ridgelines. Enemy closing from 3 sides. Friendlies pinned in a natural bowl with nowhere to run and minutes of ammunition remaining. The radio traffic told the story in fragments, taking effective fire from all sides. Casualties mounting. Need air support now. And underneath it all, the controlled voice of the SEAL Ground Force Commander, call sign Trident Actual, delivering information with the kind of calm that only comes when you've accepted you're probably going to die, but you're determined to make it useful. Any station, Trident Actual, we are danger close on all sides. Repeat, enemy within 50 meters of our position. Request immediate close air support.
Trident Actual, Viper Lead, we have visual on your position. Unable to engage. Enemy too close to friendly forces. Rules of engagement require 100-meter separation. Say again, unable to engage.
Silence on the radio, the kind of silence that screamed, because everyone in that operations center understood what they were hearing. The rules that were supposed to protect American lives were about to get 38 Americans killed.
Major Sanderson stood at the center of the room, face pale, jaw working. Options, he said. Somebody give me options. Someone suggested repositioning the SEALs. Someone else pointed out they were pinned down and couldn't move. Someone suggested artillery. Someone else noted the risk of friendly fire. The room filled with the sound of smart people explaining why every possible solution wouldn't work. And then Delaney's voice cut through the noise, clear and cold. Sir, the A-10 can work danger close. I can get them out. Every head in the room turned toward her. Sanderson's face went from pale to red. Captain Thomas, we've been through this. You're not experienced enough for... Sir, with respect, I've run this exact scenario 47 times in the simulator. I know that valley. I know the angles. I know how to kill those SAM sites and work the gun close enough to give the SEALs room to move. I can do this. Absolutely not. I'm not sending an untested pilot into a situation where... A communications tech interrupted, voice shaking. Sir, Trident Actual reports they have approximately 30 minutes of ammunition remaining.
The number hung in the air like smoke. 30 minutes. After that, the only sound from that valley would be silence. Delaney stepped closer to Sanderson, her voice dropping so only he could hear. Sir, every second we spend arguing is a second those men don't have. You can court-martial me later.
You can end my career. You can do whatever you want to me. But right now, I'm the only option they've got, and we both know it." Sanderson stared at her. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Career risk versus moral imperative. Doctrine versus desperation. For a long moment, she thought he might actually make the right call.
Then he shook his head. "I can't authorize it. The risk is too high." "The risk of doing nothing is 38 dead Americans."
"I said no, Captain." And that's when Delaney Thomas made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She looked Major Sanderson in the eye and said very quietly, "Then I'm not asking for authorization, sir." She turned and walked out of the operations center before anyone could process what she just said. Her mind was already moving through the sequence. Gear locker, get suited up, get to the flight line, get in the air. 10 minutes from decision to wheels up if she moved fast enough. Another 12 to the valley. That left maybe 8 minutes of margin before the seals ran dry. In the locker room, alone for 30 seconds, she pulled out the letter she'd written months ago and had been carrying ever since. The one that started, "If you're reading this, I acted because American lives were worth more than my career." She added a single line at the bottom. "I was right about the valley. I'm right about this. Tell my mom I love her." Then she sealed it, left it on the bench, and suited up. Aircraft 297 sat on the flight line where Morrison had left it after the training mission, fully fueled, fully armed. 1,174 rounds of 30 millimeters in the drum, 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, rocket pods, countermeasures, everything she needed. She ran the pre-flight checks at double speed. Oil pressure, hydraulics, flight controls, weapon systems, targeting pod. 90 seconds later, the Warthog's twin turbofans were spooling up, and Delaney Thomas was moving toward a runway that nobody had cleared her to use. She didn't call the tower, didn't file a flight plan, didn't request permission. She just keyed the guard frequency, the emergency channel that every aircraft monitored, and broadcast in the clear. Any station, Thunderbolt 7 departing Kandahar, inbound Korangal Halley. 38 Americans about to be overrun. I'm breaking rules to save them. If you want to stop me, you'll have to shoot me down. Then she pushed the throttles forward, felt 2 pounds of thrust press her into the seat, and lifted off into an Afghan sky that had just become her courtroom, her battlefield, and possibly her grave. The moment Delaney's wheels left the runway, every radio frequency at Kandahar Airfield exploded. The tower was shouting for her to return immediately. Major Sanderson was demanding she abort. The base commander was ordering fighters to intercept. And somewhere in the chaos, a calm voice that she didn't recognize said something that cut through all the noise. "Let her go. Those SEALs are dead if she doesn't." Delaney didn't respond to any of it. She'd already switched her radios, command frequency off, tactical frequency on. The only voices she needed to hear were the ones on the ground, the ones fighting for their lives while bureaucrats argued about procedure. She plugged the coordinates into her navigation system and pushed the Warthog up to 350 knots. Not fast by jet standards, but screaming for an A-10. 12 minutes to the valley. The math was tight. On the tactical frequency, she could hear the battle deteriorating in real time. Trident Actual's voice stayed controlled, but the situation reports told the story. Viper lead, enemy assault teams moving to within 30 meters, magazines running critical, taking casualties. And underneath his words, the sound that no amount of training could prepare you for. The sharp crack of rifles, the deeper thud of machine guns, the occasional boom of an RPG. All of it blending into the soundtrack of men fighting a losing battle. The F-16s were still overhead, circling like frustrated hawks, their pilots radioing increasingly desperate suggestions. Trident Actual, can you mark smoke and displace? Negative, Viper lead. We're pinned. Any movement draws concentrated fire. Can you consolidate to create a larger separation? Negative, we're already compressed. They're using the terrain to close on us. Delaney listened to the exchange and felt a cold fury settle in her chest. Not at the F-16 pilots, they were good men flying by the rules they'd been given, but at the rules themselves, at a doctrine that said it was better to let Americans die than to risk a friendly fire incident, at the calculus that valued clean paperwork over messy survival.
She keyed the tactical frequency. Trident actual, Thunderbolt 7, 12 minutes out. Start marking your position with IR strobes. I'll work your edge.
Thunderbolt 7, Trident actual. Confirm you have danger close authority?
She could have lied, could have said yes and worried about the consequences later, but these men were about to trust her with their lives, and that trust had to be built on truth. Trident actual, I have personal authorization from Captain Delaney Thomas to do whatever it takes to bring you home. Designate your position, and I'll handle the rest.
Another pause, then, incredibly, a sound that might have been a laugh. Copy, Thunderbolt 7. IR strobes active. Enemy positions on 3 ridgelines. Closest contact 50 meters north of our position. They're massing for a final push.
Understood. I'll be there in 11 minutes. Hold what you've got.
Roger. And Thunderbolt 7, whoever you are, we're buying you a beer if we survive this.
I don't drink beer, Delaney replied, but I'll take a whiskey. She used those 11 minutes to do what she'd been training for in secret for 6 months. She pulled up the terrain data she'd memorized, overlaid it with the current tactical picture, and built the attack plan in her head. First priority, kill the SAM sites. The F-16s couldn't help because they were terrified of the missiles. Once those threats were gone, the entire air picture would open up. Second priority, break the enemy assault formations. They were massing for a final push. Stop that momentum and buy the SEALs time to reorganize. Third priority, create an exit corridor. The SEALs couldn't stay where they were, but they couldn't move under current conditions. She'd have to carve a path through the enemy positions using 30mm cannon fire as a scalpel. Simple plan, impossible execution. Perfect. The Korangal Valley opened up beneath her at 14:15 hours, a slash of brown stone and green vegetation carved into mountains that had been killing people since before America existed. She could see the smoke from the battle, the dust from explosions, the tiny IR strobes marking friendly positions in a bowl of terrain that looked exactly like the simulator maps she'd memorized. And surrounding those strobes, like a noose tightening, hundreds of enemy fighters closing in for the kill. She keyed the radio. Trident actual, Thunderbolt 7. Visual on your position. Beginning engagement. Stay down and trust me. We're not going anywhere. Delaney rolled the Warthog into a steep dive, feeling the airframe shudder as she pushed past normal operating limits. Her eyes tracked the eastern ridgeline, where intelligence had marked the first SAM site. She couldn't see the launcher yet, they were good at camouflage, but she could see the terrain feature it would be using for cover. A rocky outcrop with good line of sight to the valley floor. Classic positioning. She selected a Maverick missile, let the targeting pod lock onto the outcrop, and pressed the release. The missile came off the rail with a solid thunk, its rocket motor igniting a heartbeat later. She didn't wait to watch it hit. She was already pulling out of the dive, already turning toward the second SAM site on the western ridge, already thinking 3 moves ahead. The first Maverick impacted with a flash that turned the outcrop into rubble. Secondary explosions, the SAM's solid rocket fuel cooking off, confirmed the kill. 1 threat down, 1 to go. The second SAM site was trickier. It was positioned behind a ridgeline, using terrain masking to hide from direct fire. The F-16s couldn't touch it because they couldn't see it. But Delaney had studied this valley for months. She knew that if you came in from the south, following the terrain contour at exactly 350 feet, you could pop up behind the ridge and get a 3-second window before the missile crew could react. She flew the approach profile she'd practiced in the simulator, feeling the Warthog buck and shake in the mountain turbulence. Her altimeter unwound toward numbers that made her survival instincts scream. 200 feet, 150, 100. The ridge rushed toward her canopy like a stone wall, and then she pulled up hard, popping above the ridgeline. And there it was, the SAM launcher, visible for exactly the 3 seconds she'd calculated, crew scrambling to bring it to bear. She fired the second Maverick from 1,200 meters, didn't wait to confirm, just pushed the nose down, dropped back below the ridgeline, and felt the shockwave from the explosion chase her through the valley. 2 for 2. The air threat was gone.
Viper lead, Thunderbolt 7, she called on the joint frequency. Both SAM sites destroyed. Airspace is clear. You're welcome to join the party, but I'm already working.
The F-16 lead's response was almost reverent. Thunderbolt 7, Viper lead. Holy shit, who are you? Right now, I'm the only thing standing between those SEALs and a body bag. Trident Actual, talk to me. Where do you need fires? Trident Actual's voice came back immediately, still controlled, but with an edge of hope now. Thunderbolt 7, enemy machine gun position on the eastern ridge, approximately 100 meters north of our position. It's pinning our entire eastern flank. 100 meters. The F-16s couldn't touch that. Doctrine said it was suicide. The manual said walk away. Every bit of training said no.
Delaney said yes. She came around for the gun run at an angle that didn't exist in any approved tactics manual. Low, fast, using terrain masking to hide her approach until the last possible second. The GAU-8 30mm cannon was already spun up, 7 barrels waiting to deliver tungsten core death at 3,900 rounds per minute. She'd practiced this shot 47 times. Now it was real. The enemy machine gun position appeared in her heads-up display. Beyond it, barely 100 meters away, the blue IR strobes marking American lives. No margin for error, no do-overs, no forgiveness.
She squeezed the trigger for exactly 1.2 seconds. The Warthog shuddered as the cannon fired, a sound like the universe tearing, like God clearing his throat. 65 rounds of 30mm ammunition drew a precise line across the ridgeline. Dust and rock exploded. The machine gun position disintegrated. The firing stopped.
Good effect, Trident Actual called. Enemy gun is silent. Eastern flank is clear. Delaney didn't celebrate, didn't feel satisfaction, just rolled into the next run, already hunting the next threat. Because this was the thing nobody understood about close air support at this level. It wasn't about single heroic shots. It was about sustained, methodical violence, about breaking enemy formations faster than they could reform, about creating psychological pressure that turned organized assault into desperate survival. Trident Actual, Western Ridge, 75 meters. Mark the position. An IR designator winked on the western slope, 75 meters, even closer than the first shot. She set up the same approach profile, low, fast, masked by terrain until the last second. Let the targeting pippers settle on the marked position. Squeezed the trigger for 0.8 seconds this time. Shorter burst, even tighter pattern. 50 rounds impacted across a 10-meter section of ridgeline. Bodies tumbled. Weapons fell. The assault element that had been preparing to rush the SEAL position scattered like leaves. Western threat neutralized, Trident Actual reported. We're still taking fire from the north, but it's sporadic. They're starting to break. They were starting to break. That was the moment. The inflection point where momentum shifted, where the enemy stopped thinking about victory and started thinking about survival. Delaney could feel it in the pattern of their fire, in the way their movements became reactive instead of aggressive. She'd studied military psychology alongside tactics, knew that morale was a weapon as powerful as any bomb. Time to use it. Trident Actual, I'm going to make a show run. Full gun, low pass, right over the enemy positions. No specific target. I just want them to see what happens when they fight Americans. Copy. Thunderbolt 7. We'll enjoy the show from down here. Delaney lined up from the north, pointed the nose at the valley floor, and dove. 300 knots.
200 feet, 100. She could see individual fighters now, see them looking up, see the moment of recognition when they realized what was coming. She pressed the trigger and held it for 3 full seconds, over 200 rounds of 30mm ammunition ripping through the valley like a chainsaw made of thunder. The effect was immediate and catastrophic, not because she killed that many people, though she did, but because of what it represented. An A-10 making a gun run that low, that slow, that close, meant the pilot wasn't afraid of anything they had, meant air superiority was absolute, meant resistance was suicide. The enemy assault broke. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough. Enough that the concentrated pressure on the SEAL position eased. Enough that Trident Actual's next transmission had a different tone. Thunderbolt 7, we have breathing room. First time all day. What's next?
What was next was the hard part, because killing the enemy assault was only half the mission. The SEALs were still trapped in a bowl of terrain with hundreds of hostiles between them and safety. They had to move, and Delaney was going to show them how.
Trident Actual, I've been studying this valley for 6 months. There's a fold on the western ridge. She rattled off grid coordinates from memory. It's shallow, barely visible from overhead, but it runs from your position to a landing zone about 800 meters west. The terrain will mask you from most enemy positions. I'll suppress anything that has line of sight.
Silence on the radio. She could imagine Trident Actual studying his map, trying to verify what she was telling him, wondering if he could trust the tactical judgment of a voice he'd never heard before.
Thunderbolt 7, I see the fold. It's tight. If we're wrong about this, we'll be silhouetted against the ridge with nowhere to go. You won't be silhouetted because I'll be putting 30mm on every position that might see you. Trust me, Trident Actual. This is your way out.
Roger, we're moving. Call your fires before we enter each bound.
And just like that, the impossible extraction began. The SEALs split into 3 teams, 1 to move, 2 to provide covering fire. Classic bounding Overwatch. Delaney became their guardian angel, their precision instrument of violence. Every time a team prepared to move, she'd identify enemy positions with line of sight to that fold in the terrain and eliminate them. Not with long bursts, with surgical taps of the trigger. 1 second, half a second, just enough to kill the threat without risking friendly fire.
Team 1, prepare to move, Trident Actual called.
Delaney's eyes scanned the ridge lines, found a position that could interdict the route, rolled in, fired a half-second burst. The position went silent.
Team 1, move now.
She watched the IR strobes flow through the fold like water finding its path. 10 seconds, 20, 30.
Team 1, set. Team 2, prepare to move.
Another scan, another threat, another precise burst of cannon fire, another position neutralized. The pattern repeated over and over, each bound getting the SEALs 10 meters closer to safety, each burst from her cannon buying them 10 more seconds of life. It was the most intense flying of her life, not because of enemy fire, though there was plenty of that, but because of the absolute precision required. She was threading needles at 250 knots, putting rounds within 20 meters of friendly forces, calculating windage and bullet drop and aircraft movement in her head because there wasn't time to let the computer do it. Every shot was a math problem solved in fractions of a second. Every trigger pull was a bet that her hands were steadier than her fear. And her hands were very, very steady.
Halfway through the extraction, an enemy element tried to get smart. They'd figured out the SEALs were using the fold and attempted to position a blocking force ahead of them. Delaney spotted the movement, a group of fighters scrambling along the ridge, trying to get into position before the Americans arrived.
Trident Actual, you've got hostiles attempting to block your route. Hold position while I clear them.
Holding. She came around hard, pulling G's that made her vision tunnel, and lined up on the moving enemy group. They were spread out, moving fast, using terrain well. A difficult target. She'd have to time it perfectly. She waited until they crossed a section of open ground, 3 seconds of exposure, and fired. The burst caught them mid-stride. 8 fighters dropped. The rest scattered, their attack broken before it could form.
Route is clear. Continue movement. The extraction continued. 50 meters, 100, 200. Each meter was earned with sweat and gunpowder. Each meter was another second closer to survival. And through it all, Delaney flew with a focus so intense that the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only the valley, the strobes, the threats, and the trigger.
Back at Kandahar, the operations center had gone silent. Officers who'd never believed in her capabilities were watching radar tracks and listening to radio calls and realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Major Sanderson stood frozen, his earlier objections dying unspoken, as he watched one pilot do what doctrine said was impossible.
The base commander, Colonel Hayes, appeared in the operations center. Someone explained to me why one of my captains is currently violating about 15 different regulations in an unsanctioned combat mission.
Sanderson found his voice. Sir, she launched without authorization. I told her not to.
I don't care what you told her, Hayes interrupted. What I care about is whether she's getting those SEALs out. A senior NCO manning the tactical display answered, Sir, she's eliminated both SAM sites, suppressed multiple enemy positions, and is currently providing precision fire support for a movement to contact. So far, 0 friendly casualties during the extraction.
Hayes studied the display. How close is she working?
20 to 50 meters from friendly position, sir.
The room held its breath, waiting for the explosion. Instead, Hayes said quietly, Then I suggest we give her every bit of support we can. Communications, open up full ISR feeds to her frequency. Air ops, I want tankers and backup CAS on standby. Medical, prep for mass casualty receiving. That woman is writing doctrine in real time. Our job is to make sure she has everything she needs to finish.
And just like that, the entire base shifted from obstacle to support. Not because Hayes was soft on discipline. He'd court-martial Delaney later if he had to. But because right now, in this moment, following rules mattered less than bringing Americans home.
The landing zone appeared as a clearing on the western edge of the valley, 800 meters from where the SEALs had started, a lifetime ago in combat terms. But reaching it meant crossing one last section of open ground that was visible from multiple enemy positions. It was the most dangerous part of the entire movement, the place where everything they'd fought for could collapse in seconds.
Tried an actual Thunderbolt 7, Delaney called, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her system. You're approaching the final bound. I'm going to make 3 gun runs in sequence to suppress every position with line of sight to the LZ. The moment my 3rd run is complete, you move fast and you don't stop. Understood?
Copy. Thunderbolt 7. We'll be ready.
Delaney took a breath and began the most complex sequence of flying she'd ever attempted. 3 separate gun runs, 3 different angles, 3 different target sets, all timed to create a continuous blanket of suppression that would give the SEALs maybe 45 seconds of relative safety to cross that open ground. First run, eastern high ground. She rolled in steep, nearly inverted, and hammered a ridgeline where enemy observers had been calling fires all day. The 30mm rounds walked across the crest like a god's footsteps. Dust and debris fountained into the sky.
Pull out, brake hard left, set up for run 2. Second run, northern approach, a cluster of buildings where a reserve force had been staging. She stitched the structures with precise bursts, not trying to level them, but to force everyone inside to keep their heads down. The psychological effect was what mattered, make them fear looking up long enough for Americans to run past. Pull out, brake hard right, set up for run 3. Third run, western ridgeline, the hardest shot. Friendlies would be moving directly beneath this position in seconds. Margin for error, 0. She lined up the approach, let her airspeed bleed to 210 knots, dangerously slow, but she needed the stability, and squeezed the trigger for exactly 0.6 seconds. 24 rounds impacted across a position that had been harassing them all day. The firing stopped.
Trident Actual, move now! Go, go, go!
Through her targeting pod, she watched the IR strobes pour out of the fold like water breaking through a dam. 38 men running in 3 groups, spacing tight, weapons up, moving with the desperate efficiency of people who knew this was their one chance. 200 meters to the LZ, 150, 100.
An RPG team popped up on the northern ridge. Delaney saw it the instant they appeared. 2 men, one carrying the launcher, one carrying spare rockets. They were setting up for a shot that would land directly in the middle of the running SEALs.
She didn't have time for a gun run, didn't have time for anything except instinct. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose toward the ground at an angle that made the Warthog's overspeed warning shriek, and fired a burst while upside down and diving. The rounds arced through the air in a parabola that shouldn't have worked, guided by nothing but physics and desperation.
The RPG team disintegrated. The launcher fell unfired.
Jesus Christ, someone breathed on the radio. Did she just...
Shut up and keep running, Trident Actual snapped.
75 meters, 50, 25. The first SEAL team reached the LZ and immediately set up a defensive perimeter. The second team arrived 10 seconds later. The third team, moving slower because they were carrying 2 wounded, was still exposed when Delaney spotted movement on the eastern ridge.
Setting up for a shot, aimed directly at the last running SEALs. She was out of position, too far east, wrong angle. By the time she could set up a proper gun run, that machine gun would have fired, and men would be dead. So she did something that wasn't in any manual, wasn't in any training, wasn't even theoretically possible according to every bit of received wisdom about close air support.
She pointed the A-10's nose directly at the machine gun position and fired while flying straight at it. No dive, no angle, just a flat, level burst while flying directly toward the threat at 250 knots. The rounds impacted 2 seconds before she screamed over the position at an altitude so low that her jet wash blew the enemy gunner off his feet.
Last team is in the LZ. Trident Actual called. All personnel accounted for. We're ready for extract.
Delaney pulled up into a climbing turn, her hands shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed, her mind catching up with what her body had just done. Somewhere in the back of her head, a voice that sounded like her flight instructor was screaming about every regulation she'd just violated. She told that voice to shut up.
Copy. All personnel accounted for, she replied. Rotary wing extract is inbound. I'll hold overhead until they're clear.
The next 10 minutes were the longest of her life. The Chinooks that arrived to extract the SEALs were massive, slow targets, and every second they spent on the ground was another second for the enemy to reorganize and launch one last desperate attack. Delaney flew a racetrack pattern around the LZ, eyes scanning constantly, finger resting on the trigger, ready to rain fire on any threat that emerged.
The first Chinook landed in a cloud of dust, rotors beating the air into submission. The SEALs loaded in groups, helping their wounded aboard, maintaining security even as salvation sat 50 feet away. 30 seconds on the ground. The helicopter lifted off, heavy with human cargo, climbing slowly through air that felt like soup.
The second Chinook landed. More SEALs loaded, more wounded secured. Another 30 seconds of vulnerability. Another heavy liftoff.
The third and final helicopter was loading the last sticks, the rear security team that had held the perimeter while everyone else got out, when Delaney's radar warning receiver screamed. SAM launch. Not from one of the sites she'd destroyed, from somewhere new. Someone had been holding a missile in reserve, waiting for exactly this moment.
She saw the smoke trail rising from a ravine on the southern ridge, saw the missile tracking toward the Chinook that was just clearing the ridgeline, full of men who'd survived the impossible, only to die in the last 30 seconds. Delaney didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh risks. She just dove. The A-10 was equipped with countermeasures, flares and chaff, designed to decoy missiles away from the aircraft. She started dispensing them as she dove, creating a cloud of false targets between the missile and the helicopter. But the missile was infrared-guided, heat-seeking, and the Chinook's engines were putting out a lot more heat than her countermeasures. So she did the only thing left. She put her aircraft between the missile and the helicopter, flew directly into the weapon's flight path, made herself the more attractive target. The missile's seeker head acquired the Warthog's hot engines and adjusted course. Delaney waited until the weapon was committed, no longer tracking the helicopter, only tracking her, and then she broke hard left, dumping flares and chaff like confetti, pulling G's that made the airframe groan and her vision go gray at the edges. The missile chased her, got closer. She could see it in her mirrors now, a telephone pole with fins and a grudge, closing the distance at Mach 2. And then, at the last possible instant, it took the bait, detonated on a cluster of flares 200 feet behind her aircraft. The shock wave hit her like a hammer. The Warthog shuddered, rolled, dropped 300 feet in an instant. Alarms screamed. She fought the controls, felt the aircraft respond sluggishly, and somehow pulled it level.
Thunderbolt 7, you hit? Someone called on the radio.
She checked her instruments, hydraulics low but functional, one engine showing reduced power, dozens of warning lights she'd worry about later. Negative, she said, voice steadier than her hands. Just making friends with physics. Chinook, you clear?
Clear and climbing, the helicopter pilot replied. All souls aboard, exiting to the north. And ma'am, I don't know who you are, but you just saved 38 lives and 6 aircrew. Drinks are on us, forever.
I'll hold you to that, Delaney said. She rolled the wounded Warthog into a lazy turn and watched the last helicopter disappear into the distance, carrying men who'd been written off, who'd been mourned before they died, who were alive right now only because one pilot had refused to accept the world's judgment about what was possible. The valley below her was quiet now. The battle was over. The enemy had retreated to lick their wounds and wonder what the hell kind of pilot did the things they just witnessed. Smoke rose from a dozen positions she'd destroyed. Bodies lay scattered on ridgelines. And in the middle of it all, an empty landing zone where 38 Americans had been standing minutes ago. Proof that sometimes the difference between tragedy and miracle is a single person who refuses to quit. She turned the Warthog toward home, nursing the damaged aircraft through air that felt heavier now that the adrenaline was fading. The flight back to Kandahar kept 23 minutes. She spent them in silence, listening to the engine that was still complaining, watching warning lights that wouldn't stop blinking, and thinking about absolutely nothing, because thinking meant processing, and processing meant feeling, and she couldn't afford to feel anything yet. The tower gave her priority landing clearance. No jokes, no bureaucratic delays, just a straight vector to the runway, because everyone on that base knew what had happened and what it meant. She brought the Warthog down on centerline, touched down soft despite the damaged systems, and rolled out to the taxiway where it seemed like half the base was waiting. When she popped the canopy and climbed out, the applause started. Not polite ceremony applause, the real kind. The kind that comes from people who understand they just witnessed something that would be told and retold for decades. Major Sanderson was there, along with Colonel Hayes and what looked like every senior officer on base. Sanderson stepped forward first. His face was unreadable, somewhere between fury and awe, discipline and gratitude.
Captain Thomas, he said formally, you departed without authorization. You violated direct orders. You engaged in combat operations that exceeded every safety parameter we've established.
You put your aircraft and yourself at risk in ways that could have resulted in catastrophic losses.
Yes, sir, she said, standing at attention, ready for whatever came next.
His expression cracked, just slightly. You also brought home 38 Americans who would be dead right now if you'd followed the rules I tried to make you follow. He extended his hand. I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry. She shook his hand, not quite sure what to say. Before she could figure it out, Colonel Hayes stepped forward.
Captain Thomas, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about chain of command, proper authorization, and the approximately 17 regulations you broke today, he said. Then he smiled. But that conversation can wait until tomorrow, because right now, I need to understand exactly how you did what you did so we can teach it to every close air support pilot in the inventory.
The questions came in waves after that. How did she know the valley terrain well enough to navigate at those altitudes? How did she calculate the gun runs that close to friendly forces? How did she eliminate the SAM sites without backup? How did she manage to fly for over an hour in constant combat without a single fratricidal incident?
She answered each question the same way. Preparation. Months of studying terrain she wasn't assigned to study. Hundreds of hours in simulators running scenarios nobody asked her to run. Memorizing ballistic tables and wind calculations and radio procedures until they became reflexive. Building skills in secret because nobody would let her build them in public.
You trained for this specific scenario, Hayes said slowly, understanding dawning. You knew it was coming.
I knew something like it was possible, sir, Delaney replied. I tried to warn people. When nobody listened, I prepared anyway, because being right didn't matter if I wasn't ready to act when the moment came.
Hayes studied her for a long moment. How many other scenarios have you prepared for that we're not ready for?
Sir, with respect, that's a longer conversation than we have time for right now.
He almost laughed. Captain, you're about to become the busiest pilot on this base because we're going to pick your brain for every lesson learned, every technique, every insight. You're going to write it down, teach it, drill it until every pilot here can do what you did today.
And that's exactly what happened. The court-martial never came. Hard to prosecute someone for saving lives, even if they broke rules doing it. The letter of reprimand appeared in her file, but so did commendations that far outweighed it. And more importantly, she got responsibility. Real responsibility. Not the kind that comes from rank, but the kind that comes from proven capability.
They created a new position for her, close air support development. She taught from first principles, using her own mission as the textbook. Here's how you read terrain like a language. Here's how you calculate gun runs at danger close distances. Here's how you maintain situational awareness when every second is life or death. Here's how you prepare for missions that don't officially exist yet. The simulator that she'd been sneaking into at night became her classroom. The scenarios she'd run in secret became the training standard. The notebook full of calculations and observations became the foundation of a new doctrine. And pilots who'd mocked her, who'd dismissed her, who'd written her off as too emotional and too inexperienced, became her students. 6 months after the Valley, the award ceremony happened. Small, professional, no media circus. The citation was carefully worded, acknowledging her actions while avoiding too much detail about the rules she'd broken. She received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with Valor device, and a letter from the Secretary of the Air Force that said simply, "Your actions embodied the highest traditions of military service." But the real award came later, privately, when a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a challenge coin from SEAL Team 7 and a handwritten note that said, "Thunderbolt 7, 38 men owe you everything. We don't know how to repay that debt, but we'll spend the rest of our lives trying. Thank you for refusing to let us die. Trident Actual." She kept that coin in her pocket every time she flew after that.
Reminder that numbers on an after-action report represented lives. That doctrine existed to serve people, not the other way around. That sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was refuse to accept answers that felt wrong, even when everyone else had accepted them.
3 years later, Captain Delaney Thomas was promoted to Major. 5 years later, Lieutenant Colonel. She never left close air support, even when opportunities came for command tours and staff positions that would have been better for her career. She stayed because the mission mattered, because training the next generation mattered, because somewhere out there, another valley was waiting, and she wanted to make sure the pilot who responded would be ready.
She still walked the flight line every morning, running her hand along the titanium skin of A-10s, checking bolts and hydraulics and systems the way she'd done as a young captain nobody trusted. She still spent late nights in the simulator, running scenarios that hadn't happened yet, preparing for problems that didn't officially exist. And she still kept a notebook, adding to it constantly, building a library of knowledge that she shared freely with anyone who asked.
One evening, years after the Valley, she was giving a presentation to a group of new pilots, fresh from training. Young faces, eager eyes, most of them barely old enough to drink legally. She showed them the tactical map of the Korangal Valley, walked them through each decision point, explained the geometry and physics and psychology of that day.
At the end, a young lieutenant raised his hand. "Ma'am, when you launched without authorization, weren't you afraid of what would happen to your career?"
Delaney considered the question. "I was terrified," she said honestly, "not of what would happen to my career, of what would happen if I failed. 38 lives were depending on me being right. That's a weight that doesn't get lighter with time."
But you were right.
That time, yes. But here's what I learned. Being right isn't about confidence. It's about preparation. I was right because I'd practiced being right. I'd studied until I knew that valley better than the people fighting in it. I'd trained until the difficult shots became routine. I'd prepared until what looked like luck to everyone else was actually skill.
She paused, looking at the young faces. "Every one of you will face a moment where the rules don't match the reality, where the doctrine doesn't fit the situation, where following orders feels wrong and breaking them feels necessary. When that moment comes, you won't have time to figure out what to do. You'll only have time to execute what you've already prepared for."
"So what do we do?" another pilot asked. "You prepare," Delaney said simply. "You study the valleys that nobody thinks matter. You practice the scenarios that nobody thinks are possible. You build skills in secret, because the military won't always give you permission to build them in public. And when your moment comes, when lives hang in the balance and everyone is looking for someone to act, you'll be ready. Not because you're braver than anyone else, because you refused to accept that preparation was optional."
She dismissed the class, but the young lieutenant lingered behind. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?"
"Go ahead. Do you ever think about that day? The valley?"
Delaney smiled sadly. "Every single day. Every time I brief a mission, every time I teach a class, every time I see an A-10 on the flight line. Because that day taught me something important. The system isn't always right. The experts aren't always expert. The rules aren't always adequate. And sometimes the only thing standing between disaster and survival is one person who prepared for a problem everyone else pretended didn't exist."
That's a lot of responsibility. It is, but it's also the job. We don't get to choose when our moments come. We only get to choose whether we're ready when they arrive. The lieutenant nodded slowly, processing. "Thank you, ma'am, for showing us that it's possible."
"It's always possible," Delaney replied. "You just have to be willing to work for it when nobody's asking you to."
Years passed. Delaney Thomas eventually made colonel, then brigadier general. She commanded wings, wrote policy, shaped doctrine, but she never forgot the valley, never forgot the sound of Trident Actual's voice, calm and controlled while his world collapsed around him.
never forgot the weight of 38 lives resting on her decisions, never forgot that being underestimated could be a weapon if you used it right.
And on a wall in her office, framed between her commission certificate and her pilot wings, hung a simple piece of paper. Not a medal, not a citation, just a handwritten note that said, 38 souls, 0 KIA. Thank you for refusing to accept defeat. Trident Actual.
Some people asked why that note meant more to her than the medals and the promotions and the accolades. She always gave the same answer. Because those medals represent what I did. That note represents who I did it for. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters.
The story of Captain Delaney Thomas spread through the military like wildfire. It became legend, then myth, then something that new pilots heard in their first week of training. The details got exaggerated with each telling. Some versions had her shooting down missiles with her cannon. Others had her flying inverted through the valley. Still others had her fighting off an entire enemy army single-handedly.
But the core truth remained. One pilot, one aircraft, one mission that saved 38 lives by refusing to accept that doctrine was more important than people. And somewhere in Afghanistan, in a valley that had seen too much death, there's a landing zone that nobody marked on any map. But the men who were extracted from that LZ know exactly where it is. And on quiet nights, when they're with others who were there, they tell the story of Thunderbolt 7, the pilot who broke every rule to follow the only one that truly mattered, leave no one behind. Captain Delaney Thomas proved that day that skill and courage can redraw the map when lives are on the line. That preparation in secret becomes execution in public. That being underestimated can be an advantage if you use the time to become undeniable. And that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is refuse to accept answers that feel wrong, even when everyone with more rank and experience says those answers are right.
38 men went home to their families because one woman refused to quit. Because one pilot spent months preparing for a mission nobody asked for. Because one person decided that impossible just meant not yet attempted.
That's not just a military story. That's a human story about what happens when preparation meets opportunity, when skill meets necessity, when one person with enough courage and enough competence decides that the rules exist to serve people, not the other way around.
And that's a lesson worth remembering, whether you ever fly an A-10 or not. If this story moved you, if Captain Delaney Thomas's courage and skill inspired you, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts on what it means to be prepared for moments that haven't arrived yet. And subscribe to hear more true stories of military valor, sacrifice, and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when the world demands the impossible.
Until next time, stay strong, stay prepared, and never accept that impossible means never. Sometimes it just means not yet.